The first question, of course, is why are we talking about debt? I mean, people living in poverty have all sorts of problems, housing, family issues, employment issues, education issues. Why debt? And all of the legal aid attorneys in the audience know that very few clients come into their office with only one problem. But let's talk about debt for a moment. I go around the country talking about the justice gap. And 3/4 of people living in poverty in the country experience one significant civil legal problem a year. Most people don't know that, but almost nobody knows that the largest category of cases which plague people are consumer and debt cases, with over half of low-income Americans facing significant consumer and debt issues every year. And that's no different here in Minnesota, where over half of the civil filings in 2019 were consumer debt cases. And within the broad category of consumer debt cases, the largest subcategory is medical and dental debt. Let me share some statistics on that. The Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that 100 million Americans, 100 million, live with medical or dental debt. That's about 41% of adults. And low-income individuals are, of course, far more likely to not have savings sufficient to deal with medical emergencies. Let's see here. Half of U.S. adults don't have the cash to cover a $500 medical expense. Think about that. How many medical procedures can you have for $500 or less? Not many. Significantly, and again, those of you who work in legal aid or the courts are familiar with this, most people who face claims of debt are unrepresented. This is true around the country, where over 90% of low-income Americans are unrepresented when they're sued in a debt collection case. And what does that mean as a practical matter? Well, of course, what it means is they default. They don't even get their day in court. Some don't even know that they had a day in court. Because of the legalese with which debt notices are filled, a lot of people don't know that they've been sued or the scope of what's being asked of them. And without help, it's unsurprising that most debt cases in Minnesota, that's 82% in district court and 54% in conciliation court, end up in default judgment. So when we talk about debt fairness, that's what we're talking about, or what we're talking about is the lack of debt fairness, where over half of the folks who are being sued never get a day in court effectively. And it's these issues which my distinguished colleagues here are going to grapple over the next few minutes. I'm joined today by John Puta, who's a staff attorney with the consumer unit at Smerls, and obviously represents clients in consumer and debt cases every day. Next to John is Kim Miller, the Senior Program Manager of Partnerships and Financial Education with Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota. Kim works directly with clients to provide financial wellness encouragement in a holistic manner. And let me just pause there for a moment because, and again, this is something that our legal aid community is well aware of. We succeed at nothing without collaboration, and that's what brings Kim to her work and with us today. And next to Kim and next to me is Katie Drehas, who's already been mentioned today. She is the Director of Pro Bono and Community Service for the law firm Frederickson and Byron. And Katie previously served as the Access to Justice Director for the Minnesota State Bar Association, where she played a key role in overseeing the creation of a consumer debt litigation report that we're going to hear more about. Kim, I'd like to start with you. Why is consumer debt particularly problematic for Minnesotans facing economic insecurity, and does debt disproportionately impact any people or groups?
Sure. Thanks again for having me. Yes, consumer debt is a struggle because who wants one more thing to deal with on a daily basis? And so when you're already struggling, and as you mentioned before, when you lack savings to have emergencies, consumer debt can seem like a lifeline temporarily to help pay the bills or to cover some things, but then it inevitably becomes another monthly obligation, which then can affect cash flow. And then you have to start making decisions as to what bills am I going to pay to make up for this new debt. And then when you throw in medical debt or dental debt, where it may not be an issue in the beginning, but then the payments might be not as flexible, or they start getting noisy. And so then people rush and they tend to then take other debt to pay off the medical debt, and they end up paying interest on that. So ultimately, it just becomes multiple things to handle, which can be overwhelming for people. And then they get into a thing called decision fatigue. And so it's a matter of when I'm juggling rent and food and utilities and transportation and insurance, and then you have all these bills, it just becomes something that it can be overwhelming and that people struggle to handle. And especially for people who are facing economic instability or low income, then they tend to be targeted for predatory lending. And so then they don't have access to traditional lines of credit or lower interest. And so then they are faced with getting options of loans that are 100 to 200% interest, and that just traps them into the cycle. And so that can be really difficult. And then ultimately, sometimes when you can't afford the monthly obligations, and they just become unpaid, and they become a form of collections, which then sometimes gets ignored and then doesn't pop up again until there's a legal issue. And we all know that sometimes it's easier to rebuild credit when you have no credit, but then when you have things on your credit history, it just becomes that much more difficult then to rebuild your credit going forward, and it just creates more and more barriers. And so sometimes you just end up with this cycle of, of just trying to get ahead and then just not finding a way out.
John, Kim just described really a debt trap cycle. How does that resonate with your experience at Smurls, and what kind of problems do you see, and what do you do to help people with those problems?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. First of all, it's an honor to be in part of the program here and share the stage with you two. I think at Smurls, part of our mission is to help our clients to become financially self-sufficient to the extent possible, given their individual circumstances. And some of the things that Kim's talking about with cash flow and the lack of funds to make ends meet certainly resonates with me and with our clients. When you think about, I think most of the audience here knows that in order to be eligible for legal services, you're talking about households that are 125% of federal poverty, maybe up to 200% in some cases, but that's not a lot of wiggle room in your monthly budget. So any kind of emergency situation, a medical event, or a car repair that you have to pay for out of pocket, that our clients are going to have to turn to debt to cover that. And then the next month, like Kim said, they're going to have to pay the monthly payment on that debt plus interest, which is going to be more expensive for our clients because the interest rates that they're able to get are usually much higher than probably what you or I are used to. So it's going to add to that cycle of debt and make it more difficult for us to achieve our goal of helping them to become financially self-sufficient.
Katie, as always, it's easier to identify the problems and the challenges, and harder to come up with solutions. But you've done some impressive work in that regard. Last fall, the Minnesota State Bar Association Access to Justice Committee released a comprehensive report on practices and policies relating to debt collection through state courts. And in your role with the bar at the time, you led the project team. What was the impetus for your study, and what were your major findings and recommendations?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. And I was part of a great team that led that, or that worked on that report. Some of them are here today. Dory Rappaport, I see Bridget Jernander, Jay Singleton, and others. And so it was a really team effort. And as you could hear from my fellow panelists, it's a big problem, not just with the legal system. It's how our society is structured, it's wealth inequality, it's our medical system. There's all these pieces. But as the Access to Justice Committee of the Bar Association, we really wanted to focus in on the legal system and how is the legal system handling consumer debt cases as they're coming in. One of the first things that kind of tipped us off to this was the paraprofessional pilot project, which we're going to talk about later. In preparing that project, they were looking at those types of court cases that had the greatest representation disparities, and consumer debt had the highest. 98% of plaintiffs in district court are represented versus 3% of defendants. So it's, basically everyone versus, basically no one. And, but they couldn't find a way that the paraprofessionals could kind of intervene in that process. And so they didn't end up including it, but it was on our radar. We knew that it didn't benefit from any of the other kind of access to justice programs like housing court. Chief Justice Hudson mentioned coordinated case calendars for housing court. We've had specialty courts, but consumer debt hadn't benefited from any of those. And so when we saw other reports come out from Michigan and Utah, and we had the chance to get some funding from the Pew Charitable Trust to really look at this data, we jumped at it. We really wanted to see this. And through that funding, we were able to work with a data analytics firm, January Advisors, who David is here representing them today. And we looked at 10 years worth of consumer debt data, and that was nearly 700,000 cases over the course of 10 years. And we then looked at the data and we talked to people. We talked to attorneys, we talked to litigants, we talked to members of the bench, to court staff, to really get an idea of what that data translated to on the ground. And that really led to the report as it stands. And I'm going to give you, I have notes because I have to keep it short. It's a 60-page report with a lot of recommendations and a lot of findings. So I'm like, okay, stay on topic here, Katie. Our biggest finding was what you mentioned, that 51% of consumer debt, or of civil court cases, are consumer debt cases. So the majority of cases being heard before our court are consumer debt. And with those tens of thousands of cases every year, very likely this is a lot of people's first interaction with the court system. So, regardless of that, but especially because of that, we want them to make sure they can engage with their case, that they can be heard, that they can be given a fair shot. We want to encourage trust in the justice system, and this is this is an entry point for a lot of people when they're interacting with the courts. We also found that Minnesota actually has lower debt rates than a lot of the country, for a lot of reasons I could go into. But we do have higher litigation rates, and so you're less likely to have debt in Minnesota. But if you do, you're more likely to get sued for it. And we found that those rates disproportionately affected BIPOC Minnesotans more than it did white Minnesotans. And then our default rates that you mentioned in district court and conciliation court are also higher than rates that we see around the country. And that two-tiered district conciliation court system is largely driven by the choice of the plaintiff. Even though conciliation court has lower default rates, there's lower costs for consumers, there's less barriers to participation, we still see a lot of cases that could be heard in conciliation court being pushed to district court. We found that most people sued for debt are above the income guidelines for legal aid, making the need for alternative fee structures and self-help materials really important for those people. We also found that Minnesota isn't keeping up with its neighbors when it comes to bank account protections. One of the team members called the legal aid attorney to we were gathering information, and she said, "Oh, I just talked to somebody this morning who their rent was overdue and they went to go try to pay it and their bank account was frozen and that they don't know what to do. It happens every day. I'm sure John that's a call that John gets. And even if that person would have been eligible for an exemption, say they're on public assistance, it still will take weeks for that bank account to become unfrozen, and that can lead to just a spiral of instability and inability to meet basic needs. And that really happens largely outside of the court process in Minnesota versus other states, which are much more involved in the garnishment process. And so the committee, one of their biggest recommendations was to create those bank account protections. And then, of course, legal aid played a big role in our report, whether it was being on the leadership team, the steering committee, or giving us feedback. They were key partners in that report. And they play a big role in solutions going forward. So whether that's through increased funding and collaboration for programs that can help more people with their consumer debt cases, or developing self-help and educational materials. We have great self-help materials here, and a plug for lawhelpmn.org. If nobody's been there, it's amazing. And we want to just keep working on improving those resources available and then continuing to bring stories and advocacy. Our legal aid partners are so good at that here. And we really want, the bottom line is we want people to be informed about their rights. We want them to be able to engage with the process and really have a fair shot in these court cases, and in a way that doesn't lead to more poverty and instability.
John, that's a perfect segue into asking you, what can legal aid do in this space, both for the people who qualify financially for your services and the tens of thousands of people who are not able to afford a lawyer but aren't quite poor enough to qualify for your services? What can we do to help those people who today are defaulting at the alarming rates we've been talking about?
First of all, let me make sure this is working. Okay. And thank you to Katie and your group for that awesome report. I think sheds a light on this issue in a really informative way, and like all the points that you already made, I wish I could just repeat those again because it's like so important. Especially the lack of representation, which is where we come in. I think, to me, some of the most exciting ways that we can help is by kind of supplementing the services that SMERLS and other legal services already provide. So, for example, the housing unit, which shout out to the SMERLS housing unit who's here. I was a housing attorney for 10 years, and I guess Justice Hudson and Jesse also, you're included in that. So, we have awesome attorneys in the housing unit, and they spot issues that are, housing adjacent. For example, landlords who are charging fees that aren't allowed under Minnesota law, that's leading to our clients being evicted. And even if when our housing unit, does great work to get the eviction resolved and get the eviction case expunged. And Minnesota has passed legislation recently to make it even easier for us to get eviction cases expunged, which is good. Now what we're seeing are landlords that are reporting debt from the tenancy on our former housing clients' debt credit reports. So they might call their housing attorney and say, "What happened? I thought you took care of this. Why is this still, preventing me from getting into housing or getting a job in some cases?" And so that's where we can come in as a consumer unit and try to address those debt issues, either by bringing an affirmative case against a debt collector or the landlord if those charges are improper, or working with financial counseling to try to address that and get that resolved so that our clients, again, can find housing, get employment, and become economically self-sufficient.
8 out of 10 debt lawsuits are actually filed against people above the legal aid threshold, obviously suggesting a tremendous need among moderate income Minnesotans. How do the offerings of your organization, Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota, how do you help this population repay their debts, afford basic needs, and regain some economic stability in the face of these debt issues?
Yes, well, I am very happy to talk about it. And financial counseling, we have been a trusted, non-judgmental service for over 30 years in the state of Minnesota, and we are proud to partner with our legal aid friends and the Attorney General's office to be able to meet Minnesotans where they are at. And so a lot of times when people come and see us, it's the first time that they've talked about their money. They get nervous. Money is not something that we talk about. It's like, oh man, we all kind of suffer in silence. But what our counselors are really great at doing is that we can help people get their finances organized for the first time. They may have laid out what is the income coming in, what is our living expenses, what are our options. I myself and other counselors have sat down with people, they've brought in their bags of mail. And sometimes the very first step is to open up everything and to organize. I remember coaching a person over the phone going, okay, that medical bill, let's take a look at the account number. That's a duplicate. We throw that one away, and just allowing them to see, okay, this is the debts, and get everything out in the open so that they are able to see, what's affordable, what might they be able to work on. So number one is we help people get organized. Sometimes in order to get legal services, you need to know what questions to ask and where you are at regarding your debt level and the situation and their rights regarding collections and active unsecured debt. Another area that we help people in is with their unsecured debt, especially with credit cards. We have a program called a debt management plan. Now, we are a nonprofit too. Our counselors are not on commission, but because we are associated with the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, our debt management plan, we have arrangements with national credit card companies where they pay, the client pays us the payment, we pay the creditors on their behalf, all their accounts still stay in their name, and they get full credit reporting of on time, paying their debt down. But the credit card companies are willing to reduce their interest rates to help them get out of debt faster. And so instead of paying 28, 29% interest on their credit card, they may be only paying, ranging between, 1 to 9%, which is a significant difference. So it allows them to pay off the debt and to keep it in good standing and avoid future debt litigation. Now, there comes a trade-off. They have to be willing to close their credit cards and, all the different nuances with that. But for a lot of people, they didn't even realize that was an option. So again, we're here and we can coach people too on how to pay their debt off on their own. Again, when they're dealing with a collector, what are their rights? I just got off the phone with the legal aid office the other day talking about hey, this is an identity theft situation, what are the steps, and we can work together. And so sometimes it's a great partnership because we can help with the what do you do with the debt, and then in collections and the credit reporting is what are their rights and how do we get all the bad stuff off their credit report so they can continue to move forward. So that is a little bit about what we do.
That's great. Katie, our board's been here for 2 days, and we have been constantly impressed by the collaboration, the impactful collaboration that exists among Minnesota's elected officials, the nonprofit sector, the organized bar, our legal aid programs, and others. This is evident in the remarks we just heard from the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and reference has been made to the Minnesota Debt Fairness Act, which was just enacted, which contained reforms including ending the automatic transfer of medical debt to a patient's spouse and banning medical debt from being reported to credit bureaus and establishing automatic income-based wage garnishment level caps. From a policy standpoint, what other changes could be made?
Yeah, we are so lucky and so appreciative of the AG's partnership, and again, just with our legal aid partners, with the courts, everybody who worked on this project has put so much into it. I think the bank account protections that I mentioned earlier were a key recommendation of the ATJ committee's report, and they were introduced at the last legislative session, but ultimately didn't make the final bill. So we're really hoping that we can continue advocacy for that piece. Chief Justice Hudson talked about the great increases in funding for legal aid that we recently achieved, which were amazing, and I hope a good start. So we really want to see those funding increases continue, at the very least, to remain stable, so that they can keep doing the amazing work that they're doing. And then there are a few justice system policies that could help. We have questions. Conciliation court has the higher participation rates and lower costs. Like, how do we steer more cases to conciliation court? How can we create specialty programs or diversion programs that might simultaneously help people and lighten the load for the court system? What are some things that we can do to work together to keep this moving? And the judicial branch has been very open to our report and willing to partner, and we're so grateful for that. And we just really want to keep working together to create meaningful change.
Thanks for that. Now for our final lightning round, 1 minute each. You're going to cure the debt ills of Minnesota with a final thought or a call to action. Kim, lead us off.
I only get 1 minute, huh? Okay. Access to better credit, like secured credit cards, to allow people to build traditional credit, not just with credit builder loans, but then allows them to have an emergency line of credit. It's not just with financial education. We should support other systems to help make lives for Minnesotans more affordable. And then also ways to be able to get out of debt when they've gotten to collection, so that it doesn't follow them forever. I think judgments is one of them. And so putting a term limit on that to allow them to be able to move forward. And then again, rebuild their credit by having access to more credit building products.
Katie, you've got 1 minute to fix the world.
Okay. Our report was released in October last year. I would love to see us, with this continued collaboration in mind, look at it 1 year later and see what we accomplished, see what our priorities are, kind of, look at that again and see where we can refocus our efforts to keep this moving forward. And I think that would go a good way in, continuing the progress that we've had so far with our partners.
John, as always, when everybody else is said and done, legal aid is left to pick up the pieces.
Thank you. Right. And this might be slightly over a minute, but it'll be worth it, because I didn't address your question about the default judgments. And I think to segue from what the report, and what you just said, Katie, we don't really know from the report why there are so many default judgments. So that's one area that another report could look at more specifically. Is it a problem with service? Is it people get served but they don't understand it? Those are the types of questions that would be good to know. But one thing that the report did identify was that, at least in those debt buyer cases, there's a significant percentage of those where the documentation that was submitted by the debt buyer didn't even meet the legal standard to entitle them to a judgment under Minnesota law. So that's another opportunity maybe for us to work with the courts to make sure that the laws that are on the books are being enforced, and the Attorney General too, we've worked with on issues like that. So that was my go back. Now my actual final word is just, thank you to LSC, thank you Ron, the board, thank you Jesse and the Smurls board for making it possible for me and the rest of the consumer unit to do this work, and for everybody here for supporting LSC. And I hope you continue. I know you will continue to support LSC.
Please join me in thanking our amazing panel.